The Republic, P-47 Thunderbolt roared over the Pacific at 12,000 feet, its massive radial engine drowning out every other sound in the world. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Johnson's hands were steady on the stick, but his mind was racing through the impossible mathematics of aerial combat. 9 Japanese Zeros were climbing toward him in a perfect V formation, their crimson sun insignias gleaming against gunmetal gray fuselages. 9 against 1. The odds weren't just bad, they were suicide. But Johnson had painted a name on his aircraft's nose 3 months earlier, back when the war was still young and he still believed in fairness. Meat Chopper, the lettering read, in stark white paint that had faded under the brutal Pacific sun. The Japanese pilots who saw that name in their final moments didn't understand English, but they learned its meaning soon enough. This was June 1943, somewhere over the Solomon Islands, where the Pacific theater had become a grinding war of attrition that consumed men and machines with equal hunger. Johnson was part of the 56th Fighter Group, a unit that had earned its reputation one dogfight at a time, turning green pilots into hardened veterans or corpses depending on how quickly they learned. The P-47 beneath him weighed 7 tons fully loaded, twice the weight of the nimble Zeros now positioning for their attack run. Every briefing emphasized the same doctrine: don't turn with a Zero, don't try to outmaneuver them, use your speed, use your altitude, use your armor. But 9 of them changed every equation. The lead Zero banked hard, its pilot clearly experienced, clearly confident. Japanese naval aviators in 1943 still retained the skills they'd honed over China and perfected at Pearl Harbor. They flew like men who understood that their aircraft was an extension of their body, not a machine to be controlled, but a tool to be wielded with artistic precision. Johnson watched them split into 3 plane elements, a textbook attack pattern designed to shred a single fighter from multiple angles simultaneously. His fuel gauge showed enough for maybe 20 minutes of combat. His ammunition counters displayed 3,400 rounds across 8 50 caliber machine guns. The math was simple and brutal. He could fire for approximately 30 seconds before those guns went silent. The first Zero dove from above, tracers stitching the air where Johnson's P-47 had been exactly 1 second earlier. He yanked the stick hard right, feeling 7 tons of American engineering respond with surprising agility. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful. It didn't dance through the sky like a Zero or a Spitfire. It moved like a heavyweight boxer, trading elegance for raw power and the kind of punishment absorption that kept pilots alive when everything went wrong. Bullets hammered into his right wing, punching neat holes through aluminum skin, but missing anything vital. He rolled, inverted, and pulled, using gravity and engine power to accelerate into a dive that would have torn a lighter aircraft apart. 2 Zeros followed, their pilots skilled enough to match his descent, but not experienced enough to understand what came next. At 8,000 feet, Johnson pulled out hard, his vision tunneling as G-forces crushed him into his seat. The Zeros pulled with him, but their lighter frames bled energy faster in the turn. For exactly 3 seconds they hung in his gun sight, close enough that he could see the pilots' helmets, close enough that missing would require intentional effort. He pressed the trigger. 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted in unison, the combined recoil actually slowing his aircraft's forward speed. The effect on the Zeros was catastrophic. The first aircraft simply disintegrated. There was no explosion, no dramatic fireball, just structural failure so complete that the Zero transformed from aircraft to debris in the span of a heartbeat. Metal fragments tumbled through the air, trailing fuel vapor and pieces of what had been a man seconds earlier. The second Zero took hits across its engine cowling, and black smoke began pouring from cylinders that would never fire again. Its pilot had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to ride the dying aircraft down or take his chances with a parachute over open ocean. Either choice led to the same place. He didn't make it. 7 Zeros remained, and now they were angry. Japanese combat doctrine emphasized group cohesion and coordinated attack, but that discipline frayed when pilots watched their wingmen torn from the sky. 3 peeled off to pursue Johnson as he climbed back toward altitude, using the P-47's superior engine power to claw his way above the fight. The other 4 circled, patient and dangerous, waiting for gravity to bring him back down into their kill zone. This was the moment that defined Pacific air combat. American pilots had better aircraft, better armor, better radios. Japanese pilots had better training, better tactics, and a cultural framework that made death in combat not just acceptable, but honorable. Johnson leveled off at 14,000 feet, his engine straining in the thin air, his oxygen mask feeding him canned breath that tasted like rubber and metal. Below him, the 4 patient Zeros maintained their orbit, knowing that fuel and physics would eventually force him down. Behind him, the 3 aggressive Zeros were climbing hard, losing ground to his more powerful engine but persistent in a way that suggested either great courage or complete disregard for personal survival. He checked his fuel gauge again. 15 minutes. The nearest friendly airfield was 20 minutes away at cruise speed. Longer if he had to keep fighting. The decision tree in aerial combat collapses to simple branches very quickly. Run, and maybe get shot down from behind. Stay, and definitely run out of fuel. Attack and create chaos that might open an escape route. Johnson chopped his throttle and rolled inverted again, pointing the P-47's nose straight down toward the 4 Zeros below. 7 tons of aircraft accelerated toward terminal velocity, with the kind of speed that made the airframe shudder and groan. The Zeros scattered, breaking their formation as the Thunderbolt plummeted through their altitude like a meteor. He selected one, led the turn, and fired again. 50 caliber rounds designed to penetrate armor plate and destroy engines accomplished both tasks with clinical efficiency. The Zero's wing root exploded where structure met fuselage, and the aircraft began tumbling end over end, pieces separating with each rotation. Johnson didn't watch it fall. He was already pulling out of the dive, already bleeding speed and altitude, already looking for the next threat. His vision grayed at the edges as blood struggled to reach his brain under crushing G-forces. The stick felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Every muscle in his arms screamed. Then he was level again, and 6 Zeros remained. But something had changed in the dynamic. The aggressive 3 who had been chasing him down were now below him, having dove to intercept his attack. The patient 3 who had been waiting were now scattered across the sky, their formation discipline shattered. For exactly 5 seconds, nobody was in position to shoot at anyone else. Johnson used those seconds to make distance, pointing the P-47's nose toward home and pushing the throttle to maximum continuous power. The engine responded with a roar that vibrated through every rivet in the airframe. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stacks as the radial burned fuel at rates that would have horrified the mechanics who maintained it. The Zeros pursued, but now they were behind him and below him, the 2 worst positions in aerial combat. They had speed and maneuverability. He had momentum and horsepower. The chase became a race against mathematics, each pilot calculating fuel consumption versus distance remaining, ammunition expenditure versus kill probability. Johnson's radio crackled with static and fragments of other people's. Someone was calling for help 15 miles north. Someone else was reporting a downed pilot in the water. The airwaves carried the soundtrack of a war that was consuming men faster than training programs could replace them. 2 Zeros closed to firing range, their pilots good enough to anticipate his moves, skilled enough to put rounds near his aircraft. Tracers arced past his canopy, bright against the blue Pacific sky. He jinked left, then right, never holding a course long enough for them to establish a proper lead. Each maneuver cost airspeed. Each course change brought him closer to stall speed. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft, but physics applied equally to all machines. Get slow enough, and the wings stop generating lift. Stop generating lift, and you fell. Fall far enough, and the ocean was exactly as hard as concrete. Then the fuel situation changed the equation again. Johnson's gauge showed 10 minutes remaining. The Zeros behind him had been burning fuel at combat power for nearly the entire engagement. Simple mathematics suggested they were approaching the same crisis. He watched them in his mirror, waiting for the moment when fuel concerns overrode combat aggression. It came at exactly the wrong time. 1 Zero broke off and turned for home. The other pressed the attack, closing to 300 yards, close enough that Johnson could see the pilot's face behind the curved windscreen. He remembered the name painted on his own aircraft, Meat Chopper. The nickname had started as a joke, something the ground crew painted as a morale booster after his first confirmed kill. But the Japanese pilots who saw it in combat had given it a different meaning, a reputation that preceded him into every engagement. Intelligence reports captured from downed enemy aircraft included hand-drawn sketches of American fighters, with notes in Japanese identifying the most dangerous opponents. His P-47 appeared in 3 separate reports. The translation was imperfect, but the meaning was clear. This aircraft kills. The pursuing Zero fired again, and this time rounds hammered into Johnson's tail section. Metal screamed. Something important broke with a sound like a church bell being struck with a sledgehammer. The stick went mushy in his hands, hydraulic pressure dropping as fluid poured from severed line. He looked back and saw daylight through holes in the rudder where solid metal should have been. The Zero was lining up for another pass, and Johnson's aircraft was now damaged badly enough that violent maneuvering might break it apart completely. So he stopped maneuvering, he steadied the stick, and let the P-47 fly straight and level, presenting the Zero pilot with a target so perfect that it had to be a trap. The Japanese pilot hesitated, years of training warning him that nothing in combat comes easy, that obvious targets hide certain death. In that moment of hesitation, Johnson reached down and adjusted his mixture control, forcing the engine to run rich, pouring extra fuel into cylinders that responded by belching thick black smoke from the exhaust. To the Zero pilot behind him, it looked like catastrophic engine damage, like a wounded aircraft limping home on its last moments of mechanical life. The Zero moved in for the kill, closing to 100 yards, then 50. Johnson could hear the enemy engine now, could hear the high-pitched scream of its prop tips cutting through thin air. He watched in his mirror as the Zero's nose lit up with muzzle flashes. Then he yanked the stick back and to the right, pulling the P-47 into a climbing turn so violent that something in the damaged tail section tore completely free. The Zero flashed underneath him, its pilot committed to a gun pass that now found only empty sky. Johnson rolled inverted at the top of his climb and came down on the Zero's tail like a hammer. The geometry was perfect. The range was point blank. He fired until the guns ran dry, until all 300 to 400 rounds had cycled through 8 barrels and left them smoking hot. The Zero came apart in midair, excess ammunition in its wings cooking off from the heat of burning fuel, secondary explosions turning the aircraft into a falling firework display that tumbled toward the ocean, trailing smoke in 3 different colors. 5 Zeros destroyed, 4 fled or turned back, 1 American P-47 damaged but still flying. Johnson pointed the Thunderbolt toward home and nursed it through the sky on failing hydraulics and a tail section that looked like Swiss cheese. His fuel gauge read 5 minutes. The nearest friendly airfield was 7 minutes away. The mathematics of survival had narrowed to a problem with no good solution. He pulled the throttle back to minimum sustainable power and began gliding, trading altitude for distance, gambling that he could stretch those 5 minutes of fuel into 7 minutes of flight. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The engine coughed once at 3 minutes remaining. It coughed again at 2 minutes. At 1 minute, the propeller began windmilling, driven by airspeed rather than engine power. Johnson trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed and calculated his chances. The airfield was visible now, a brown strip carved from jungle, close enough to see but too far to reach. He was going to land in the ocean 300 yards from safety. The irony was almost funny. Survive 9 Zeros only to drown within sight of home. Then the wind shifted. A thermal rising from the jungle below caught the P-47's wings and gave him 200 feet of free altitude. 200 feet translated to 30 seconds of additional glide time. 30 seconds was exactly enough. He cleared the airfield boundary with 50 feet to spare, dropped the landing gear manually when hydraulics failed to respond, and greased the Thunderbolt onto the runway with a touchdown so smooth that watching mechanics later claimed he'd done it just to show off. The tail section dragged on concrete, throwing sparks, finally collapsing completely as the aircraft slowed to taxi speed. Johnson shut down the dead engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to hot metal tick and cool. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, counting holes, shaking their heads at damage that should have been fatal. Someone counted 107 bullet strikes. Someone else found fragments of Japanese ammunition embedded in the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, stopped inches from where they would have severed Johnson's spine. The crew chief walked around the aircraft twice before speaking. When he finally did, his voice carried the kind of respect reserved for men who had looked at death and refused to blink. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Johnson nodded, still processing the fact that he was alive. "This aircraft is never flying again. I don't know how you got it home, but by every rule of engineering and common sense, it should have broken apart 10 minutes ago." Johnson climbed out of the cockpit and looked at the wreckage that had been his aircraft, Meat Chopper. The name was still visible on the nose, though holes had punched through the letter O and part of the T. He thought about the 5 Japanese pilots who had seen that name in their final moments. He thought about their families, who would receive notification that their sons or husbands or fathers were missing in action, lost somewhere over the Pacific in service to their emperor. He thought about how war turned young men into killers and called it duty, how it transformed murder into heroism, depending entirely on which flag you saluted. "Get me another aircraft," he said quietly. "Same paint scheme, same name." The crew chief blinked. "Sir, you sure? That name draws attention. Every Japanese pilot in the Solomon Islands knows about Meat Chopper. You're painting a target on yourself. Shisao." Johnson looked at the wreckage again, at the testament to violence that had kept him alive through an engagement that should have killed him 5 different ways. He thought about the mathematics of survival, about how every combat mission was a problem in probability that eventually resolved to 0. The only question was which mission it would be, and whether you took your principles with you when the numbers finally caught up. "That's the point," he said. "Let them know who's coming." 3 days later, Johnson took another P-47 into combat over the same stretch of ocean. The new aircraft wore the same name in the same white paint, Meat Chopper. Word had spread through Japanese naval aviation units about the engagement, about the single American pilot who had destroyed 5 Zeros and damaged 2 others before limping home on a dying aircraft. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that Japanese pilots had begun calling him the Ghost, a reference to the way he seemed to survive situations that should have been fatal. Over the next 6 months, Johnson flew 91 combat missions. He was credited with 28 confirmed kills, making him one of the highest-scoring American aces in the Pacific theater. But the numbers didn't capture the reality of what those missions cost. They didn't document the nightmares that followed every engagement, the way his hands shook for hours after landing, the growing distance between who he had been before the war and who he was becoming under its influence. War transformed men in ways that medals and mission reports could never adequately describe. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself became a legend in the Pacific. Early in the war, pilots had complained that it was too heavy, too cumbersome for the kind of dogfighting that Zero pilots excelled at. But combat revealed different truths. The Thunderbolt could absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter. It could dive faster than anything in the Japanese arsenal. Its 8 50 caliber machine guns delivered firepower that turned aircraft into debris and made armor plate irrelevant. Pilots who learned to use those advantages stopped trying to turn with Zeros and started using tactics that played to American strengths. Speed, power, overwhelming violence of action. Japanese pilots adapted too. They learned to recognize P-47's by engine sound before they appeared visually. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the Thunderbolt's weaknesses, forcing American pilots into turning engagements where the Zero's superior maneuverability could be brought to bear. The aerial war became a chess match played at 300 miles per hour, where mistakes resulted in death and perfect execution merely kept you alive until the next engagement. Both sides learned. Both sides evolved. Both sides bled. By December 1943, Johnson had been in continuous combat for 8 months. He had seen friends die in crashes and dogfights and maintenance accidents that turned routine flights into funeral arrangements. He had written letters to parents explaining how their sons had died bravely, knowing that brave was often just another word for unlucky. He had attended memorial services where empty boots and rifles represented men who had been blown apart so completely that there was nothing left to send home. The war had become his entire world, a grinding routine of briefings and missions and debriefings, and trying to sleep through dreams that replayed the day's violence in endless variation. One morning, he woke up and couldn't remember what his mother's face looked like. The realization hit him like a physical blow. War hadn't just taken months of his life. It had begun eroding the person he had been before, replacing memories of home with memories of combat, substituting the faces of dead pilots for the faces of family. He sat on his bunk for an hour, trying to force the memory back, trying to rebuild his mother's features from fragments of childhood recollection. The image wouldn't come. War had taken even that. That afternoon, he flew another mission. 4 Zeros engaged his flight over Rabaul. He destroyed 2 of them in a diving attack that left his wingman shaking with adrenaline and admiration. When they landed, the wingman asked how Johnson stayed so calm under fire, how he made decisions that seemed impossible in the moment, but obvious in retrospect. Johnson didn't have an answer that made sense. The truth was that he had stopped feeling fear in the normal way. Survival had become mechanical, a series of trained responses executed without conscious thought. He flew the way other men breathed, automatically and without consideration of alternatives. The war in the Pacific ground forward through 1944. Island by island, the Americans pushed toward Japan, paying in blood for every mile of ocean and every strip of contested jungle. The air war intensified as Japanese forces concentrated their remaining strength for desperate defensive actions. Johnson flew through it all, accumulating mission tallies and kill counts that meant everything to the statisticians keeping score and nothing to the men who understood what those numbers represented. Each number was a person who had woken up that morning, eaten breakfast, written a letter home perhaps, and then climbed into an aircraft that became their coffin. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In March 1944, Johnson's war ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a bureaucratic decision made by officers who had never seen combat. He had exceeded the maximum number of combat missions allowed for fighter pilots. The logic was simple. Pilots who survived long enough became too valuable to risk. Their experience made them more effective trainers than replacers. Johnson was ordered stateside to teach new pilots the lessons he had learned in blood over the Pacific. He protested. He argued that his place was in the cockpit, not in a classroom. The orders stood. His final mission was a bomber escort to Wewak. No enemy fighters appeared. The bombers dropped their ordnance on Japanese positions that fired back with anti-aircraft guns, throwing black puffs of shrapnel into the air that the bombers flew through without significant damage. Johnson circled above the mission, watching other pilots do the work, feeling useless and old despite being only 24. When they landed, he climbed out of meat chopper for the last time and walked away without looking back. Looking back made it harder. The flight home took 3 days, hopping from airfield to airfield across the Pacific, each stop a progression backward through the war's geography. The Solomon Islands gave way to New Guinea, then Australia, then Hawaii. The American mainland appeared on the horizon like a memory of a place that had existed before he understood what fear really meant. When the transport aircraft touched down in California, Johnson stepped onto concrete and smelled air that didn't carry the stench of burning fuel and cordite. The absence of those smells felt wrong somehow, like returning to a world that had moved on without him, while he was frozen in an endless cycle of combat and survival. The Army Air Forces put him to work immediately. New pilots needed training, and the training tempo had intensified as the war's scope expanded. Johnson taught them everything he knew. He taught them that altitude was life, that speed was safety, that hesitation killed more pilots than enemy fire. He taught them to trust their aircraft, to understand that the P-47 would take punishment that seemed fatal, and keep flying. He taught them that fear was acceptable as long as it didn't paralyze, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. What he couldn't teach them was how to process what they would see, what they would do, what they would become. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and those lessons changed men in ways that training never prepared them for. Johnson watched each class graduate and deploy overseas, knowing that some percentage of them would never come home. The mathematics of attrition were brutally consistent. Train 100 pilots, lose 20 in their first 10 missions, lose another 30 over the next 100 missions. The survivors became aces or instructors or broken men who could no longer function in the cognitive dissonance between what they had done and who they believed themselves to be. By 1945, the war's end was mathematically certain, but chronologically unclear. Germany surrendered in May, shifting American focus entirely to the Pacific. The air campaign against Japan intensified to levels that made previous operations seem gentle by comparison. B-29s burned Japanese cities with incendiary raids that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Fighter pilots strafed ground targets with impunity as Japanese air defenses crumbled under the weight of American industrial production. The war had become a machine that consumed resources and produced corpses with industrial efficiency. Johnson followed the news from training bases in California and Texas. He read reports of battles over Iwo Jima and Okinawa, saw casualty lists that included names of men he had trained, received letters from former students who wrote to thank him for lessons that had kept them alive. Some letters arrived months after they were written, delivered by a postal system that struggled to keep pace with the war's geographic expansion. Some letters were returned unopened, stamped with official notices that the recipient was deceased or missing in action. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs ended the war with violence so complete that it rendered conventional combat obsolete. Japan surrendered on August 15th, and the machinery of war began its long process of winding down. Millions of men who had become soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen began the even harder process of becoming civilians. Johnson mustered out in November 1945, trading his uniform for civilian clothes and a discharge certificate that entitled him to benefits he didn't want and recognition he couldn't process. He went home to Oklahoma, to a town that looked exactly as he remembered but felt completely foreign. People smiled and shook his hand and thanked him for his service. They asked polite questions about the war that demonstrated they had no framework for understanding what he had experienced. How do you explain to someone who has never been in combat what it feels like to watch a man die in front of you? How do you describe the specific texture of fear when 9 enemy fighters are trying to kill you, and survival depends on decisions made in fractions of seconds? The gap between his experience and their comprehension was too wide to bridge with conversation. He tried to adjust. He got a job, he went to church on Sundays, he smiled when people expected smiling, and nodded when they talked about how good it was that the war was over and things could return to normal. But normal was a concept that no longer had meaning. Normal was before. Normal was when he didn't wake up at 3 in the morning from dreams of burning zeros and pilots who looked at him with recognition in their eyes as they died. Normal was when his hands didn't shake from adrenaline that had nowhere to go because there was no longer any danger requiring response. The nightmares didn't stop. Some nights he dreamed about the engagement with 9 zeros, But in the dreams, he wasn't skilled enough, or fast enough, or lucky enough. The dreams showed him variations where the bullets found their mark, where the engine died at the wrong moment, where physics and mathematics aligned to produce his death instead of theirs. Other nights he dreamed about the pilots he had killed, imagined their final moments, constructed narratives for men he had never met, but whose deaths he had authored. The dreams were worse than the actual combat, because in dreams there was no training to fall back on, no tactical problems to solve, just horror presented in variations that his subconscious mind created with impressive creativity. Months became years. The war receded into history, while Johnson remained trapped in its aftermath. The country moved forward, building suburbs and highways, and a prosperity funded by industrial capacity that had been developed to produce weapons, but now manufactured consumer goods. Veterans tried to reintegrate into civilian life with varying degrees of success. Some managed the transition smoothly, channeling wartime experience into peacetime careers. Others struggled, finding that the skills that had kept them alive in combat had no peacetime equivalent. Johnson fell somewhere in between, functional but fundamentally altered. He didn't talk about the war unless directly asked, and even then his answers were brief and carefully sanitized. He never mentioned Meat Chopper by name. He never detailed the engagement with 9 zeros. He never explained what it felt like to watch an aircraft disintegrate under your guns, to know that your actions had just erased another human being from existence. Those memories belonged to a version of himself that he tried to keep separate from the person he was attempting to become. The separation wasn't entirely successful. In 1950, the Korean War started, and the military began calling up reserves and reactivating veterans with critical skills. Johnson received notification that his expertise was needed, that the country was once again asking men to set aside their lives and apply violence in service of political objectives. He read the letter 3 times, feeling the familiar pull of duty conflicting with the equally strong desire to never return to combat. The decision took 2 weeks. In the end, he concluded that his war was over, that he had given enough, that survival obligated him to honor the men who hadn't survived by living the peaceful life they never got the chance to experience. He wrote back declining the recall, citing medical reasons that were technically accurate even if they didn't capture the full truth. The nightmares qualified as a medical issue. The way his hands shook when he heard aircraft engines definitely qualified. The fact that he sometimes couldn't leave his house for days because the weight of memory made normal interaction impossible absolutely qualified. The military accepted his declination without argument. They had enough volunteers that forcing reluctant veterans back into service wasn't necessary. Someone else would go to Korea. Someone else would learn what combat cost. The 1950s passed in a haze of routine that Johnson maintained through conscious effort. Work, home, sleep when possible. Avoid crowds. Avoid loud noises. Avoid situations that triggered memories he was trying to suppress. His life became small and controlled, the opposite of the chaos that had defined his war year. Some veterans found community in organizations like the VFW or American Legion, gathering with other men who understood what couldn't be explained to civilians. Johnson avoided those groups. Being around other veterans meant talking about the war, and talking about the war meant remembering, and remembering made the nightmares worse. He married in 1956 to a woman who knew he was a veteran but didn't know the details of what he had done. She was patient with his silences, understanding that some subjects were too painful for discussion. She learned to recognize when he was having a bad day, when the memories were too close to the surface for him to function normally. She never pushed for information he wasn't ready to provide. The marriage worked because she accepted him as he was, rather than trying to fix him or understand him completely. Some damage was permanent, some wounds didn't heal. By the 1960s, a new generation was learning about war firsthand in Vietnam. Johnson watched news coverage of air combat over North Vietnam and recognized familiar patterns. Different aircraft, different geography, but the same fundamental dynamic of young men killing each other at high speed, while politicians debated objectives and the public slowly turned against the whole enterprise. He felt sympathy for the pilots flying missions over Hanoi, knowing that they would come home changed in ways that would take years to understand. He felt anger at the system that kept producing wars, that kept finding reasons to send young men into situations where survival was probability and death was mathematics. He began having conversations with his wife about the war in small increments, parceling out pieces of his experience in doses small enough to be manageable. She listened without judgment, asking occasional questions but mostly just providing space for him to process memories that had been locked away for decades. The conversations helped, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually he found that speaking about what he had experienced reduced the power those memories held over him. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became less frequent. The shaking hands became occasional rather than constant. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In 1978, Johnson received a letter from Japan. It had been forwarded through multiple addresses, delayed by bureaucracy and the difficulty of tracking down veterans decades after the war ended. The letter was written in careful English, translated from Japanese by someone who understood both languages but struggled with the cultural gaps between them. It was from the son of one of the Zero pilots Johnson had shot down over the Solomon Islands in 1943. The letter explained that the son had spent years researching his father's death, trying to understand the circumstances of how a skilled naval aviator had been lost in combat. Japanese records from the war were incomplete, destroyed in the chaos of defeat, but the son had pieced together fragments. He knew the date, he knew the location, he knew that his father had been part of a 9-plane formation that engaged a single American P-47. He knew that 5 of those 9 pilots never returned. Through correspondence with other veterans and painstaking research, he had identified Johnson as the American pilot responsible. The letter wasn't accusatory. It didn't assign blame or demand justification. Instead, it asked a simple question. Could Johnson share his memory of the engagement? Could he provide details that might help a son understand his father's final moments? The son explained that he wasn't seeking closure or revenge or even understanding in the conventional sense. He simply wanted to know that his father's death had meant something, that he had died fighting bravely rather than senseless. Johnson sat with the letter for a week before responding. He thought about that day in 1943, about the impossible mathematics of 9 against 1, about the decisions made in fractions of seconds that resulted in men living or dying. He thought about the Zero pilot who had pursued him after the others turned back, about how that persistence had sealed his fate. He wondered if that pilot had been the letter writer's father, if the man's final moments had been the ones Johnson remembered most clearly because they had come closest to resulting in his own death. His response was careful and honest. He explained what he remembered of the engagement, describing the tactical situation without glorifying the violence or minimizing the cost. He confirmed that the Japanese pilots he had faced were skilled and brave, that their deaths resulted from circumstances and decisions rather than any deficiency in ability or courage. He explained that in combat, there are no good choices, only least bad options, and that survival often depends on factors beyond anyone's control. He ended the letter with an apology that he knew was inadequate but offered anyway, an acknowledgement that war creates grief that extends far beyond the battlefield. The son wrote back thanking him. They continued corresponding for several years, an unlikely connection forged through shared tragedy. The son sent photographs of his father, images of a young man in naval aviation uniform who looked nothing like the faceless enemy Johnson had constructed in memory. Seeing those photographs hurt in ways Johnson hadn't anticipated. They transformed abstract enemy into specific person, made it impossible to maintain the psychological distance that had allowed him to function after the war. But the pain was necessary. It was the price of acknowledging what he had done, of accepting responsibility for actions taken under circumstances that made them simultaneously justified and unforgivable. The correspondence forced Johnson to confront aspects of his wartime experience that he had avoided for decades. He began reading books about the Pacific War from Japanese perspectives, trying to understand the cultural and historical context that had produced the men he had fought against. He learned about the Bushido code that shaped Japanese military culture, about the complex relationship between duty, honor, and death that made Japanese pilots willing to take risks that seemed suicidal to American observers. He came to understand that the men he had killed weren't monsters or fanatics, but products of their culture and circumstances, no different fundamentally from himself. This understanding didn't erase the nightmares, but it changed their character. Instead of faceless enemies dying in his dreams, he began dreaming about specific people with families and histories and futures that his actions had prevented from existing. The dreams were harder to bear in some ways, but they felt more honest. War wasn't abstract, it was specific. Every person killed was someone's son or father or brother or husband. Every death created ripples of grief that extended across decades. Acknowledging that reality was painful, but denial was worse. By the 1980s, Johnson had become something rare among his generation of veterans. He was willing to talk publicly about his wartime experience, not to glorify combat or to seek recognition for his achievements, but to bear witness to what war actually costs. He gave occasional interviews to historians documenting the Pacific Campaign. He spoke at schools when asked, trying to help young people understand that the clean narratives of good versus evil that dominated popular culture bore little resemblance to the moral complexity of actual combat. His message wasn't pacifist exactly, but it was skeptical of the way societies talked about war. He emphasized that combat was horror, regardless of whether the cause was just, that killing damaged the killer even when the killing was necessary, that victory in war was measured in degrees of loss rather than absolute triumph. Some audiences received these messages uncomfortably, preferring stories of heroism and sacrifice that didn't include uncomfortable questions about cost and consequence. Johnson told those stories anyway. The men who hadn't come home deserved honesty, not comfortable mythology. The nickname Meat Chopper had followed him through life in ways he never anticipated. Historical accounts of the Pacific Air War mentioned it. Aviation enthusiasts built models of his P-47 with the name carefully painted on the nose. He received letters from people who wanted to know the story behind the name, who assumed it was something he had chosen for himself rather than something the ground crew had painted as a joke that took on darker meaning through repetition. He explained when asked that the name was a reminder rather than a boast, a memorial to the men whose deaths had created his survival. In 1991, Johnson attended a reunion of P-47 pilots who had flown in the Pacific Theater. The gathering was small. Most of the men who had flown those missions were dead from age or illness, or the delayed effects of stress that had worn their bodies down over decades. The survivors were old men now in their 70s and 80s, carrying memories of a war that seemed increasingly distant from the world their grandchildren inhabited. They talked about aircraft and missions and men they had known, comparing notes on what had become of their lives after the war ended. One pilot mentioned that he had never been able to adjust to civilian life, that he had stayed in the military through Korea and Vietnam because combat was the only context where he felt competent. Another explained that he had spent 40 years trying to forget the war and had mostly succeeded, that he rarely thought about those years anymore and preferred to keep it that way. Johnson listened to these different approaches to processing the same fundamental experience and recognized that there was no right answer, no correct way to integrate combat into a civilian identity. Everyone found their own path through the aftermath. Some paths worked better than others, but all of them involved carrying weight that never fully dissipated. During a quiet moment in the reunion, one of the pilots asked Johnson directly about the 9 Zeros. The story had become somewhat legendary among P-47 pilots, growing in the telling until it bore only partial resemblance to what actually happened. Johnson corrected the exaggerations and provided accurate details, describing the engagement without embellishment. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then one of the pilots spoke. "We all have missions we can't forget, days when the odds were impossible, and we somehow made it through. But most of us don't talk about them, because talking makes them real again. Why are you different? Why are you willing to remember?" Johnson thought about the letter from Japan, about the son seeking information about his father's death, about the obligation that survival created. He thought about all the men who hadn't made it home, who didn't get the chance to struggle with memory and meaning and the work of integration. He thought about Meat Chopper, both the aircraft and the name, and what they represented. "Because forgetting feels like betrayal," he said finally. "Not just betraying the men we lost, but betraying the truth of what we experienced. War changed us. Denying that change, pretending we're the same people we were before, that dishonors what we went through and what it cost. Remembering is hard, but it's the only way I know to make the experience mean something beyond just survival." The conversation moved to other topics, but Johnson's answers stayed with several of the pilots. A few approached him later to talk privately about their own struggles with memory and integration. They shared stories they had never told their families, memories they had kept locked away, because speaking about them felt dangerous or inappropriate or simply too painful. Johnson listened without judgment, recognizing his own experiences reflected in their words. The reunion became a temporary space where the weight of carrying those memories could be shared, distributed among men who understood what couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. The years continued to pass. The 20th century gave way to the 21st. The veterans of World War II became an increasingly small population, dying at rates that made clear within a generation they would all be gone. Johnson watched fellow pilots and friends pass away, attended funerals when he could, sent condolences when he couldn't. Each death was a reminder that memory was fragile, that the direct experience of the war was slipping away, being replaced by historical accounts that could preserve facts, but not the lived reality of what those facts meant. In 2005, Johnson was contacted by a documentary filmmaker working on a project about air combat in the Pacific. The filmmaker wanted to interview veterans before they were all gone, to create a record that captured their voices and perspectives, while direct testimony was still possible. Johnson agreed to participate, understanding that his own time was limited, and that speaking now meant creating a record that might help future generations understand what their grandparents had experienced. The interview took place over 2 days. The filmmaker asked detailed questions about tactics and aircraft performance and specific missions. Johnson answered those questions, but he also insisted on discussing the psychological and moral dimensions of combat that purely tactical accounts often ignored. He talked about fear and anger, and the strange intimacy of trying to kill another pilot, while he simultaneously tried to kill you. He talked about the way combat collapsed moral complexity to simple binaries of survival, and how that simplification made it possible to function in the moment, but created problems that lasted decades after the war ended. When asked about the engagement with 9 Zeros, Johnson provided details but emphasized context. He explained that the outcome wasn't inevitable, that small changes in circumstance would have produced completely different results. He talked about the role of luck and positioning and the specific capabilities of the aircraft involved. He refused to frame the engagement as proof of American superiority or personal heroism, insisting instead that it demonstrated the random nature of survival in combat, where skill and courage were necessary but not sufficient conditions for staying alive. "The men I killed that day were as skilled as I was," he said to them. "Some of them were probably better pilots technically. They died because circumstances aligned in my favor rather than theirs. That's not heroism. That's mathematics and chaos functioning within the framework of aerial combat." Understanding that distinction matters, because if we attribute survival to virtue or skill alone, we dishonor the men who died through no fault of their own. The documentary was completed in 2007 and aired on a cable network specializing in historical programming. Johnson watched it once, uncomfortable seeing himself on screen, hearing his own voice discuss events from 6 decades earlier. But letters and emails from viewers suggested the documentary had accomplished something meaningful. Young people wrote to say it had given them new understanding of what their grandparents had experienced. Veterans from later wars wrote to express gratitude for someone articulating experiences they had struggled to communicate. The filmmaker won an award for the project and credited Johnson's willingness to discuss difficult subjects as central to the documentary's impact. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Johnson's health began declining in 2008. Decades of stress had taken their toll, and age was finally catching up to decisions and experiences from more than 60 years earlier. He had surgery to address heart problems related to the sustained stress of combat flying. The recovery was slow and incomplete. His hands, which had steadied a control stick through impossible situations, now shook from age and deteriorating nerves. His memory, which had retained tactical details from hundreds of combat missions, began failing in ways that frustrated and frightened him. His wife cared for him through the decline with the same patience she had shown throughout their marriage. She read to him when his vision failed. She helped him navigate when his memory faltered. She sat with him during the bad nights when the nightmares were particularly intense, and the present became confused with memories of a war that had ended before most living people were born. In those moments, she would hold his hand and remind him gently that the war was over, that he was safe, that the Zeros weren't coming back. In his final years, Johnson received a steady stream of correspondence from aviation enthusiasts, historians, and people who had learned about his wartime service. Some letters asked for autographs or photographs. Some requested interviews or details for research projects. Some simply wanted to thank him for his service and sacrifice. He tried to respond to all of them, dictating letters to his wife when his hands could no longer write legibly. He always included the same caveat in his responses: he hadn't been special or extraordinary. He had been a young man doing a difficult job under terrible circumstances, and the fact that he survived while others didn't was luck more than anything else. One letter stood out from the others. It came from Japan, from the grandson of the Zero pilot Johnson had corresponded with decades earlier. The grandson was a pilot himself, flying commercial aircraft for a Japanese airline. He wrote to express gratitude for the relationship Johnson had maintained with his family, for the honesty and dignity with which Johnson had treated his grandfather's memory. The grandson explained that understanding his great-grandfather's death in context, knowing the details and circumstances, had helped multiple generations of his family process loss that had shaped their family history for decades. Johnson's response was brief, limited by failing health, but sincere in its expression. He wrote that building understanding across the divide created by war was among the most important work former enemies could do. He expressed hope that future generations would find ways to resolve conflicts without the kind of violence that had defined his generation's experience. He thanked the grandson for reaching out and for choosing a career that connected people rather than separating them through conflict. That exchange was among Johnson's final pieces of correspondence. His health continued declining through 2009. He spent increasing amounts of time sleeping, his body shutting down systems in the gradual progression that marks the end of life. During his waking hours, he was often confused, sometimes believing he was back in the cockpit, sometimes talking to people who had been dead for decades. His wife stayed close, providing comfort even when he didn't recognize her, maintaining vigil through the final stages of a journey that had started in an Oklahoma childhood and taken him through war and survival and decades of processing what both had meant. Robert Johnson died in December 2009, aged 88, surrounded by family who loved him even when they couldn't fully understand the weight he had carried throughout his life.